If you are 65 or above, there's a 70% chance that you will need some type of long-term care services in your lifetime. Now, the duration of that care will be over 3 years. Now, there's two problems. Number one, it's very expensive and Medicare doesn't cover it. So in this video, I'll explain how you can be prepared for long-term care expenses. So the first question is, what is long-term care? I think the very best definition comes from Medicare's own website, and here's what they say. Long-term care is a range of services and support for your personal care needs. Most long-term care isn't medical care. Instead, most long-term care helps with basic personal tasks of everyday life, sometimes called activities of daily living. And as we look at this issue of long-term care, we'll find over and over that Medicare says they're not going to cover it. And the reason for that is Medicare exists to cover things that are medically necessary where there's a high likelihood of recovery. So when people have long-term care needs, it's not about medical care, as this definition said, it's all about personal care. Now, this goes on to say that you can get long-term care at home, in the community, in an assisted living facility, or in a nursing home. It's important to start planning for long-term care now to maintain your independence and to make sure you get the care that you may need in the setting that you want now and into the future. So what is long-term care? We saw that it is typically what we call custodial care. Custodial care. And what that means is custodial care would be things that would relate to bathing. So this means that someone cannot bathe on their own. They need substantial assistance with this. It could be issues like continence. In other words, they have issues going to the bathroom, all right? And then also dressing. This person doesn't have the ability to dress themselves. They can't button up a shirt, or they can't put a shirt on over their head, those kinds of things. Also, eating. So long-term care would mean you cannot feed yourself and you need assistance with that. That would be substantial. Also, mobility issues are a big long-term care issue, and that means typically we call it transferring. That means someone is in a wheelchair and they cannot get onto the stool, or they can't get into the bed without assistance, and that's transferring. Mobility issue just means there's some type of physical impairment that they're going to need assistance with. Also, we know not only physical issues could be long-term care, but also cognitive issues, and that would be someone that's been diagnosed with dementia at some stage, or maybe even Alzheimer's disease. So these things are very, very critical, but again, they're custodial. Medicare does not exist to cover custodial needs. Medicare exists to cover medical needs. Now, it is true, let's say someone has a cognitive issue, they have dementia, or they have Alzheimer, and then they have a heart attack, or they have a stroke, or there's some other kind of medical need going on, then Medicare will cover that medical need as well as the custodial care that's needed while that medical need is being treated. But once there's recovery, then again, now it's all back to custodial care, and that's where long-term care coverage will be the issue, because it's not going to be covered by Medicare. So these are the items that are considered long-term care. Now, the second question that we have to address will be this one: who will need long-term care? Now, we all know about the baby boomers, and by the way, I am a baby boomer. The baby boomers are people that were born between 1946 and 1964. So right now, anyone who's a baby boomer is somewhere in the range of being 77 to 59. All right. So most of the stats that are out about who will need long-term care are dealing with the population of the baby boomers. And so if you're within that range, here are some of the very important stats to note. Number one, there is a 30% chance that you will not need long-term care. In other words, there will never be something that's going to happen to you where you're going to need this substantial assistance with these activities of daily living. 30% chance, which means what? There's a huge chance that you will need. That's 70%. So 7 out of 10 of you are going to need some kind of a long-term care issue. Now, they say right now that the average stay, and this should be, of course, across the country, is 3.2 years for someone who has a long-term care need. That's a long period of time. And so this is very interesting as they look at the population right now. For ladies, the average is 3.7 years, and for men, it is 2.2 years. All right? And so the whole point is, who's going to need care? Well, 70% of you are going to need that. And again, it'd be one thing if that care was only necessary for 6 months or a year, but it's not. It's a long period of time. So when people have these issues where they need the care because of the longevity of life, they're going to need it for quite some time. Hey, just real quick, we often hear from our viewers that they wish that they would have seen a video earlier because they made a decision that really wasn't in their best interest, or they made a decision without having this information and it cost them financially. And we don't want that to happen to you. We upload 3 times every week, and the only way you're going to know about our new videos is if you subscribe to the channel and hit the bell notification. We're constantly giving away brand new strategies, updates, and comparisons that you don't want to miss. So click the subscribe button below this video right now and turn on notifications so that you never miss another video. Now, the third issue that we need to address, and the question we have to answer, is this one. What's the actual cost of long-term care? And so that annual number is broken down into 2 actual numbers. Number 1, they have what they call uncompensated care. Uncompensated cost of long-term care. All right. Now, right now, that number is $450 billion a year. Uncompensated means someone did not get paid for that. That means the care provided was actually done by a family member or a friend who was not compensated for that. So that's $450 billion a year. Now, for compensated care, okay, now we're talking about compensated. That means someone was paid for this, facility or professional providing this care. Right now, that number is $275 billion a year. All right. Now, those are large numbers for our minds to, get our head around those numbers, but they are accurate. And so when you think about what I shared earlier with the average length of stay in a long-term care facility, right now it is 3.2 years. All right. Remember, 70% chance that's what you'll need. And so again, remember we said for ladies, the average stay right now is 3.7 years. For a man, it is 2.2 years. And so when we look at the actual numbers of someone needing this care for that period of time, I did some research on this. I'm going to share this with you. Right now, the average private room, in other words, the average cost of a private room in a long-term care type of facility is $108,000 a year. That is $108,000 a year. You break that down, folks, that is $9,000 a month. Okay, so if we're in for the average, we're talking here 108 times 3, so that's well over $300,000, $324,000 a year that the average person is going to need for long-term care expenses. Now, if we downgrade a little bit and we decide that we can get by with a semi-private room, this actually drops down to $94,000 on average throughout the year. So that's going to bring this down to about $7,800 and some change a month. So now we're talking $8,000 almost a month. So again, that's about $300,000 a year for a semi-private room for the average stay in a skilled nursing facility. Now, we're a nationwide company, and I'm not sure exactly where you live right now, but I did some research on this, and we actually have some high and some low. So let me just share those with you as we talk about the cost of this long-term care. And folks, remember why this matters, because Medicare is not going to pay the majority of these costs. You're going to have to, or have insurance for it, or have Medicaid or something, which we'll talk about here in our next slide. But the point is we have high states and some low states. Now, right now, on the high side, New York, Connecticut, and Alaska. The average right now is $13,000 a month for long-term care in those states. The low side right now, and this would be Missouri, Oklahoma, Texas, some of those Midwestern southern states, right now is $7,800. Excuse me, is $5,400. My bad, $5,400 on a monthly basis. Okay, so again, this would be Missouri, Oklahoma, Texas. This is Connecticut, New York, and Alaska. So you can see there's quite a range. But nevertheless, even if we're here, we're still talking well over $60,000 a year. And again, for 3 years, we're talking still, pushing $200,000, about $180,000, $200,000. So the whole point is, it is very expensive when we need this care. And with the high likelihood of us needing it for such a long period of time, we're going to have to be prepared to make sure we can cover those expenses. That takes us to our last slide. All right, that brings us then to our final issue, and that is the cost of these long-term care expenses. Who's going to be covering them? Now, let's be reminded first off that we know that Medicare only covers things that are medically necessary, right? Medically necessary. And that is it. That means Medicare does not cover things that are considered to be custodial, which again is the majority of long-term care needs, are dealing with the issues of continence and bathing and dressing and eating and transferring and mobility and cognitive issues, dementia and Alzheimer's, all right? And so Medicare does not cover those. Medicare will cover those things that are medically necessary. And where do they do that? Well, they're going to do that typically under Medicare Part A and B, right? And this is done in a skilled nursing facility. All right, and so a skilled nursing facility is a place where medically necessary care is being taken care of by Medicare, and so Medicare covers actually the first 100 days in a skilled nursing facility. But if someone is in that skilled nursing facility beyond 100 days, Medicare doesn't cover it all. And then secondly, what's happening in this situation, now we're moving into some type of a long-term care situation, because that 100 days is primarily just for rehab or high likelihood of recovery. And so now we're talking about someone that is not going to recover. They're going to continue to have issues with bathing or dressing or continence or transferring or mobility, other issues, as well as cognitive problems. And so now we know that Medicare is not going to cover that. All right, so we know Medicare is going to cover some of it. So as we look at this, again, $270 billion annually that's spent, let's talk about the breakdown of this. So first off, and I did some research on this, 47% of that cost for long-term care is actually paid by Medicaid, okay? Now, the difference between Medicare and Medicaid is Medicare is a federal program for those people that are eligible for Medicare at 65 or maybe younger if they had a disability or had Alzheimer's, or had Lou Gehrig's disease or permanent kidney failure, all right? But again, Medicaid is different because that's a federal and state program, and that is based upon someone's income as well as their assets. And we'll talk about that here in just a minute, but I'll make sure you know that Medicaid does pay, but the problem is it's only for those with low income, low assets. In addition to that, we have that 23% of long-term care is actually paid by Medicare. Well, why is that? Well, that is someone that had a long-term care need in conjunction with a medical need. Remember what I said earlier. If it's custodial only, Medicare doesn't pay. But if I have a health issue going on, I have maybe a heart attack or stroke or some issue that's happening, and Medicare is treating that, and I have some custodial needs in conjunction with that, then Medicare will cover, again, those long-term care expenses. So that's where that's actually coming from. In addition to that, we have 23% of all these expenses are also then paid just out of pocket. So this would just simply be private. This is people, paying out their own savings accounts, their own investments, those kinds of things. So as we can see right now, we've got about, what would that be? About 3% of all the expenses so far. So we have 7% outstanding, and the breakdown would be this. 4% is covered by the VA. Okay, so some veteran benefits that's going towards long-term in VA facilities. And then 3% is actually covered by long-term care insurance. All right, so this is someone that went out and bought while they could still qualify. They bought some kind of an insurance policy to cover their long-term care expenses. So very, very few people have those. And what's interesting about the long-term care insurance option, they say that right now, for people that are 40 and above, there's about 35% of all people have actually set aside some money to cover long-term care expenses, all right? And so that means that 65% have not whatsoever. So most people go into retirement really not prepared for this, thinking that maybe the government's going to pay for it. All right, and so we know that Medicare pays some, but usually not because it's custodial needs, and so many people are going to be relying on Medicaid. And so I think it's important that we look at how someone actually is going to get Medicaid to cover their long-term care expenses. Otherwise, then what's going to happen if you don't qualify for Medicaid and you did not have a long-term care insurance policy, you're going to have to wait until you're eligible for Medicaid. So let's look at that. Hey, if you're finding this video helpful, I want to invite you to go right up here and actually click on a link that will allow you to watch what I call the Medicare Essentials Workshop. It's a workshop that I did that really is going to show you everything you need to know about Medicare from A to Z, how to enroll, when to enroll, and the plan options for you. So go to that link and check it out. All right, so again, Medicare is for what? This is a federal program. This is going to be the federal government on its own. And then we have Medicaid. The way Medicaid works, it is federal. They actually contribute to it, but it is really regulated by the state. All right, so it's a federal and state combination program. And again, it's only for people who are low income and low assets. And again, this is seen throughout the country. And so every state has different eligibility requirements. But I want to at least kind of teach you the general guidelines of someone being qualified for Medicaid. And so what we have with Medicaid eligibility is we have what's called the federal poverty level. Now that varies depending upon whether you're single or married or people in the household. But right now that number is $14,580 of income or less. This would be wages. So if someone is below that federal poverty level, then they would be eligible possibly for Medicaid based upon income. We also have to look at assets as well, but income alone, again, this is going to be someone that is single. Now, just so you know, there are some states that actually have a higher percentage above the federal poverty level because that level is published every year. And so there could be a state that could say you qualify for Medicaid if you're at 138% of the federal poverty level. And so if we were being a state like that, that would be $14,580. And 138% of that then, in that state, we'd be at $20,120. So as long as our income was below that number, and that's what the number of the state's looking at, then again, we have that eligibility satisfied as far as income is concerned. There are some that are 150%. I think the highest right now is about 200%. But the whole point is you will not qualify for Medicaid unless your income is going to be below these percentages of the federal poverty level. Okay, all right, so that's the first criteria when we talk about qualifying for that Medicaid state federal program is the federal poverty level, depending upon this would be your income. But not only do they look at your income, they're also going to look at your assets. All right? And so when it comes to assets, these are the things that you own. What they have what they call exempt assets and those that are non-exempt. And so an exempt asset means they're not going to count that against you as far as your eligibility for Medicaid. A non-exempt means they're absolutely going to count that, all right? And so when we talk about exempt assets, again, these are things that are not going to hurt us. We can have these assets and still be able to qualify for Medicaid. Let me just list a couple of these for you. Number one, your home. In other words, you have a lot of equity in your home, even up to $500,000. That's $552 actually. Then that still would be exempt for the state Medicaid to count that. Also, you have personal belongings, your household goods. You can have one vehicle that they will not count against you. Also, in some states, income-producing property is actually exempt. Some states they count it, some states they don't, depending upon where you live. Also, burial spaces that you own would not be counted against you. You can also have $1,500 designated towards a burial fund for you and your spouse, and again, they will not count that against you, and up to $1,500 worth of cash value in a life insurance policy. So as you can see, a few things in there that would be exempt. So they're going to look at my income, they're going to look at my assets. So those that are exempt then are going to be off limits as far as me being able to qualify for Medicaid to actually pay for long-term care expenses. And so then next we need to look at what they call these non-exempt assets. And these things are not off limits, okay? These things are actually going to count against you. So these are things that you own and you're either going to have to sell them or do some type of a transfer because they're absolutely going to count these. So let's go through the list of that. This would be any kind of cash that you have in the bank, savings accounts, checking accounts, any CDs that you own, any U.S. savings bonds that you have, IRA accounts, 401k accounts. Now there are some what they call community spouse accounts in certain states that they will not hold against you. But as a general rule, we're looking at all these investment vehicles that we have set aside, 401ks, 403bs, IRAs, those types of things. Also, real estate beyond your personal residence. Now remember, I said there are some states that won't count income-producing property against you. But again, some states are saying those would be non-exempt. So you have to decide if that's going to be counted or not, depending upon where you live. We said one car was exempt, but any cars beyond that are going to be counted against you. If you have any boats or recreational vehicles, again, stocks or bonds, mutual funds, those brokerage accounts you have, those are going to be non-exempt as well. Any land contract or mortgages that you hold for real estate that you sold, all these things are non-exempt. And here's the point. All those assets then are going to either have to be sold, transferred away in advance, because these things will keep you from qualifying for Medicaid, therefore Medicare Therefore, Medicaid is not going to pay for your expenses until you spend those down, all right? And so basically, when you think about it, people who qualify for Medicaid, number one, low income, and number two, virtually no assets whatsoever. In fact, in some states right now, you can only have a small amount of cash in the bank. Some states as low as $1,000 total in the bank, and some states $2,000. But there's going to be some kind of a limit on our income as well as our assets. So my point is, as we look at long-term care, what you have to decide is how are you going to address those issues? We've learned Medicare is not going to pay for it because it's primarily custodial, and so Medicaid's only going to pay for it if indeed you are broke, basically. And then the other options, of course, would be to have enough money set aside. And again, if the average stay is 3 years and it's $100,000 a year, you're going to have $300,000 per person set aside, or you're going to have some type of a long-term care insurance policy. Now, remember, you got to qualify for long-term care insurance. So this is something you're concerned about. You ought to do it in advance while you still qualify. It's kind of like you don't go out and get a homeowner's insurance policy when the home is burning down. It's too late. And so if you already have some issues going on, you may not qualify for that long-term care insurance policy. And I will tell you this, right now, something that's very popular is what we call a hybrid policy. Hybrid. And what this is, and we do a lot of these today, there's a lot of people who will actually do a life insurance policy, life insurance, and they will add to that what we call a long-term care rider. All right. Now, life insurance, again, you still have to qualify, but it's not near as stringent as what it would be on a long-term care insurance policy. Plus, if you happen to be in that 30% that never need long-term care, that life insurance then would be left to your beneficiary. So again, there's no waste of money whatsoever. And so when we add a long-term care rider to a life insurance policy, what's happening is that life insurance face value, it's $200,000 or $300,000 or whatever it is, a great portion of that face value of the policy can be used for long-term care expenses. And again, there's a rider attached to that. There may be a small fee, but it makes a lot of sense because if I never need it, I haven't lost it because my beneficiaries will still get the face value of that policy. All right. And so the whole point is you've got to be prepared for this because, again, it's very, very expensive. I hope you fall in that class of the 30% that will never need it. But if you fall in that 70% that will need long-term care, you got to be prepared for it.